Welcome to my channel, where the scariest stories come to life. Before we dive into today's chilling tale, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications, so you never miss a story. Now, let's get into the horror. Some background information: I really love the summertime. I enjoy hiking, being outdoors, and camping with friends. So during the summer of 2005, I was already planning a little overnight camping trip in a national forest a couple of towns away from where I live. It's important to mention that I usually do these kinds of things solo, and this was my first time visiting that specific national forest. I guess I was ultimately unprepared for this trip because, while on my way there, I realized I had forgotten to bring a ground cover for my tent. Since I didn't have a tent with a built-in ground cover at the time, this was a problem. I also forgot some other small things. However, I was already more than halfway to the national forest, so I said, screw it, and kept going. Since it was just going to be an overnight trip, things got worse when there was a lot of traffic on the highway, which delayed me by a couple of hours. I kept glancing at the sky and the setting sun, thinking it was already getting dark. After 20 minutes of driving from the exit, I reached the mountains, where there were trees on either side of the road. Not having been there before, I thought I was already in the park. I briefly wondered why there were no signs at the entrance, but I was behind schedule and needed to set up camp, so the thought disappeared as quickly as it came. After another 20 minutes of driving through the dense forest, the road turned to gravel. I thought to myself, this must be some sort of camping area, right? Looking back, I should have turned around then, but I was exhausted and stubborn by that point, so I was determined to find a camping spot. I finally parked near a clearing on a dirt path and set up camp there. When I got out of my truck, everything seemed fairly normal. The only odd thing was the lack of sound: no wind, no frogs, no owls, not even a wolf's howl. Just the crickets and me. It was already past 9, so I had dinner, sat around the campfire for a while, and then went to bed. I woke up at 11:15. At first, I thought I woke up because my back was stiff from sleeping on the bare ground, but my back felt fine. I concluded I had woken up randomly, so I tried to go back to sleep. Soon after closing my eyes, I heard a deep, raspy noise not far in the distance. That must have been what woke me up. I sat up immediately, muttering to myself, what the hell was that? It didn't sound like any animal I knew. I tried to calm myself, thinking maybe it was an owl being killed by a wolf or something. After a few minutes of trying to fall asleep, I was suddenly jolted awake again by that same shrieking sound, this time right next to my tent. In pure shock, I jumped up, burst out of the tent, and ran in the opposite direction of the sound. I didn't look back and didn't see what it was. I ran for a few seconds before slipping down a hill and tumbling until I stopped. I stayed as still as possible, hoping the thing didn't see me fall. I listened carefully, there was no sound. After a few moments of silence, I peeked over the hill to try to see my campsite in the pitch darkness, but I couldn't see anything. Then I realized the crickets had stopped chirping, and the forest was completely silent. It seemed like everything was clear, so I decided to make a quick dash to my tent, grab my pack, which had my wallet and most importantly, my keys, and get out of there. I moved quickly but quietly, eventually getting my keys from the pack. I made my way to the car, unlocked it, and started the engine. As I sped away, I made the mistake of looking back at the tent. Crouching beside it was the thing. Even in the darkness, I could make out its features: black eyes, a body covered in short white hair, and a form barely resembling a human. It saw me. The creature let out a screech I now knew all too well. I floored the gas pedal and didn't stop until I reached a hotel far from the forest. I must have looked like a crazed backwoodsman when I walked into the lobby, dirty and still in my pajamas, but I got a room and collapsed into the bed, utterly exhausted. That night, I had a nightmare. In it, I was watching myself sleep in the motel room when the creature appeared at my window and let out a horrific screech. I woke up in a panic, listening to nothing but my own heavy breathing and the distant sound of crickets. I might be paranoid, but I'm fairly certain that at one point during the night, I heard that same screeching sound again, off in the distance. This happened to me about a year ago on a camping trip with my dad in late July or early August. It was a weekend trip, and we were the only ones at the campground. For privacy reasons, I won't mention the name of the park, but I will say it was in Indiana. Anyway, one night, I woke up suddenly in my tent. I checked the time on my phone. It was around 3:30 a.m. I was hesitant to get out of the tent, but my bladder was screaming, so I had no choice. Normally, the sounds of the forest would have been comforting, but for some reason, this time, they unsettled me. About 50 yards uphill was a porta potty, and since I'm a girl, I couldn't just pee in the woods. So, I grabbed the headlamp my mom had loaned me, turned it on, and headed toward the porta potty. I was talking to myself, trying to calm my nerves, mostly complaining about my bladder and how dim the headlamp was. The light was so faint that it only illuminated about 5 feet in front of me, so I had to rely on the moonlight to guide me. I made it to the porta potty without incident, relieved myself, and then headed back to the tent. When I was about halfway back, it hit me: the forest had gone completely silent. Eerily silent. My mind started racing with thoughts of creatures lurking in the woods. Skinwalkers, Wendigos, Bigfoot, anything and everything was waiting to snatch me up. I panicked and sprinted the last 20 yards back to camp, running faster than I ever had before. As I reached camp, the headlamp died completely. Catching my breath, I suddenly felt like I was being watched. I turned to face the tree line near the lake and saw a pair of large, glowing yellow eyes. My tent was very close to the tree line, meaning whatever this was, it was less than 15 feet away. Frozen in fear, I stared back at the eyes. My headlamp was out, but the creature's eyes continued to glow. I'm a rational person, so my first thought was that it must have been a coyote or a large stray dog, and my headlamp had just reflected off its eyes, giving the illusion that they were glowing. But when the headlamp went out, the eyes didn't. They were glowing on their own, a golden yellow. Terrified, I took a few steps back and lost my balance, falling onto the ground. The eyes grew closer, and the moonlight revealed a silhouette far larger than any coyote or dog. It appeared to be standing on its hind legs. If I had to guess, the creature was over 6 feet tall, with a hunched body and the head of a dog. The shape of its head reminded me of a husky or wolf. Now, I know most people who claim to encounter dog-like creatures mention feeling a strong sense of malevolence from them. Oddly, I felt the opposite. The creature's eyes didn't seem malicious or intent on harming me. Instead, it felt curious, or maybe even confused. After what felt like an eternity, though it was probably just a minute, the creature got back down on all fours and retreated into the forest, making no sound as it left. Was it a dogman, a werewolf, or something else? I don't know. But I'm sure it wasn't a bear. We don't have grizzlies in Indiana, and black bears are rare. Honestly, I'm still at a loss for what I saw. It left no tracks in the muddy banks by the lake. If anyone has any idea what it could have been, please comment below and let me know. I was backpacking in Arkansas, on the Eagle Rock Loop in the Ouachita National Forest. There is a section of the trail that goes through an area called the Albert Pike Recreation Area. In June of 2010, a flash flood tragically killed 20 people, including men, women, and children. There are many stories online about this event if you want to look it up. I started my trip at Little Missouri Falls, going counterclockwise. It's a 26-mile loop with some pretty good climbs. You can easily find a map of the loop on Google Images. If you search for the Eagle Rock Loop map, you'll find a basic sketch, not a topographical map, just one with the trail labels, mountains, and water crossings, often found on Pinterest. At the bottom of the map, there's a single water drop with a yellow circle around it, which indicates an always wet crossing. There are several of these marked, and the one at the very bottom, right next to the Viles Branch Trail, is exactly where I was camped. So, anyone can look it up and see what I'm talking about. That spot is the Little Missouri River, and the water flows away from Albert Pike. I was maybe 4 to 5 miles downstream from where the flash flood occurred. I'm not sure if that's significant to my story, but I'm not ruling it out. I set up camp around 4 p.m. It was November of last year, and the nights were cold. The previous night had dropped to about 26 degrees, and I was expecting another night in the high 20s. Not much movement occurs around this time, as the cold tends to keep animals hunkered down. I used a tarp with both ends open, an inflatable sleeping pad, and my 35-degree sleeping bag. I set up on completely level ground, got into my bag, and fell asleep around 10 p.m. after sitting by the fire. Everything seemed normal throughout the evening and night. You know when you're asleep, and in your dream, you feel like you're falling? You tense up and wake up just before impact. Well, I was asleep, and suddenly I got the sensation that I was being dragged out of my tarp by my feet, or at least, that's what it felt like at first. But I realized it wasn't my feet. I was being pulled by my sleeping bag, with my entire pad and me in it, quickly being dragged out. I woke up abruptly, startled. Keep in mind it was really cold, probably in the low 30s to high 20s by that point, and I had my sleeping bag fully closed off to stay warm. So, I'm lying there wide awake, listening for any movement. Everything was still and quiet, except for the sound of the river next to me. That was the only noise I could hear. I didn't peek out of my bag, I just laid there, alert, for a good 15 minutes, listening. There was no movement around my camp. The river was pretty loud, but aside from that, nothing. I chalked it up to the dreamlike sensation of falling, assuming I must have been dreaming about something that made me feel like I was being dragged. I stayed awake for another 30 to 45 minutes, still listening, but eventually convincing myself that it had to have been a dream. I managed to fall back asleep. Morning came, and I got up to start my day. I put my shoes on, rolled out of bed, and went straight over to the fire to get it going again because it was freezing, about 6:30 a.m. As I turned back towards my tarp to get my food, I noticed something strange that made me freeze in place. My pad and sleeping bag, at the foot end, were sticking out from under the tarp by at least 1.5 feet. I immediately thought back to the sensation of being dragged out during the night. Staring at my bed halfway out from under the tarp, I slowly approached it, looking for any signs of footprints or disturbances. The ground was so compact that I couldn't even see my own footprints, and there was no slope, the ground was completely flat. I had no idea how this could have happened. I know I was startled awake by the sensation of being pulled, and my pad and sleeping bag had indeed been dragged out from under the tarp. After seeing this, I quickly had breakfast, packed up, and headed out. I was supposed to spend one more night on the trail, but as I hiked, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened the night before. The thoughts kept running through my head all day. Could it have been another person? I didn't hear anything, so why would anyone do that? Could it have been an animal? But there were no punctures in my mattress, and no footprints anywhere. I couldn't figure it out. Did I slide out during restless sleep? But I've slept on slight inclines before and never slid out of the tarp. Was it something paranormal? I wasn't far from Albert Pike. Could it have been the ghost of someone trying to relive the horror of that flash flood, trying to save me from a danger I couldn't see? Thanks for sticking around till the end. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to give the video a like and leave a comment with your thoughts. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a terrifying tale. See you in the next one.